increment 2 games. The game starts off with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6. Lorenzo, a strong player from Italy, rated 2572, but of course Hans is a big favorite here in the tie break. He is almost 150 elo points stronger than his opponent, and a delayed exchange variation on c6. Hans gets a bit of some napkins there. Maybe his health is not the best. We do not know. Bishop takes c6, taken. D takes c6, rook e1 played by Lorenzo. Seems like his preparation there. Knight to d7 and pawn to c3. Trying to play d4, and Niemann tries to stop d4 anyway. d4 takes once, takes back, and now taking on d4, followed by knight e5. Looks like the most logical way to continue, but Hans goes castles, and this actually would have allowed white to push d5. Hans is not interested in taking the pawn on d4, so actually Lorenzo can push forward with d5, but he first goes a4, and Hans pushes the pawn on b4. The knight jumps in, attacking the bishop. Bishop comes to b7, well, threatening to take the knight here. You take on e7, queen e7, and now d5, limiting this bishop. White gets a very good version here of the opening, but maybe f5 is something to consider, although it looks super risky with e5 in the position. He goes rook e8, and now Lorenzo can calmly put pressure on the opponent. Bishop f4 is a nice move. Bishop g5 provoking something, also possible. He goes bishop g5, f6. Hans doesn't go for that. He goes queen to d6, and now queen to d2 played. a5, trying to put the bishop on a6, knight on b6, and start playing with the queen side pawns. But you can see here white has already a very firm majority in the center and on the king side. Rook c1, he goes rook to d8, and now queen to c2, a useful move to reroute the knight from d2 to c4. Bishop a6 played, and there we go, knight to d2. He plays rook to c8. It's one of those positions where you are kind of at a loss to what to do. You know, white is clearly pressing here. Bishop drops back to g3, and now Hans finally tries to break in the center, hoping to undouble his pawns, but Lorenzo says, sorry Hans, that's not going to happen. He pushes his pawn to d6, rook comes to d8, and now maybe just knight to c4. He goes knight f3, he doesn't want to trade that. He plays his knight to f3, maybe e5 is on the cards. Queen goes to g6, and knight h4, attacking the queen. The knight is coming into f5 to e7, queen e6. Hans in big trouble here, and he jumps in, knight f5, pawn comes to c4, and now b takes c4 is good, but he goes knight d4 back, attacking the queen and also the pawn on c6. Queen comes to f6, but can we simply not take the pawn here? Well, then there is rook c8. He goes e5. What a move. If knight e5, you have bishop e5, rook e5, and knight takes, or maybe again take on e5 and knight c6. So that's the reason why he goes queen g6. We trade queens, h takes, and now b takes c4. Taken. Pawn up position. Hans pushes forward with c5. But you go in and attack another pawn. So that's the second pawn that's falling on a5. 2 pawns up for white. But now the bishop can drop back, which is what Hans does, and attacks the knight and the pawn on a4. The knight goes back to b3. And you have rook takes a4. So black recovers one of the pawns, but look at these central pawns. They look so good. They look so good. Rook a3, trying to dislodge the knight from b3. You have rook to b1, defending the knight. But now bishop f2, and you're going to lose this pawn as well. Bishop a6. Hans is going after the c4 pawn. Lorenzo going after the c5 pawn. Rook c8, trying to defend that pawn. Hans not letting go of the rook, brings it back to e8. Plays it finally, rook to c8. And now the problem is knight takes c5 anyway comes. And that's a big issue, because after knight takes, bishop takes, rook takes, you have d7. And if rook d3, you have rook d1, and you have to give up your rook. Takes. So he must take back here. But now simply taking the pawn on b4 is enough. White is 2 pawns up, completely winning. The only hope for black is to blockade on the light squares, because he has an opposite colored bishop. He can try and blockade on the light squares. Not going to be easy. Rook d1, rook takes d1, rook takes, bishop comes back to e6. Lorenzo has a minute on the clock. Hans has 1 minute 38 seconds, threatening d7, d8 queen. Bishop comes back to d7. Now rook b1 to rook b7 could be an idea. Yes, he plays it. King f8, need to be careful. He goes bishop c7, not the best move, because f6 is possible, and then, you know, getting the king in. But Hans doesn't play it. He goes king e8. He's trying for this, again, blockade. Bishop c6, king d7, and play on the light squares. And Lorenzo goes rook a1. And need to go bishop c6, I guess, to play rook a8. He goes bishop e6. Maybe not the best. King f2. Now king d7. But rook a7 would be a very powerful move to get in. But h3. And now Hans has a chance. Bishop d5 and rook a8. Yes, he plays it. He finds bishop d5. A rook trade would end the game. It's a draw then, if the rooks are traded. So Lorenzo needs the rooks. g4. And now rook to a8. Black is back, and Hans Niemann, if he can save this game, that would be a huge thing. Pawn to g4. And rook a8 played. He stops it, he blocks it. But now f6, Hans must find this idea. But he goes king e6. It's a mistake. It's a big mistake, because now you have f5 takes, and whichever pawn you take, I have d7, d8. There's a lapse in judgment, and Lorenzo finds it. And you can see every time Hans makes a mistake, he adjusts himself in the chair. G takes f5, king d7. But now that blockade is gone. King e3 played here. Maybe there's some insane idea with g5 that can still hold it for black. But it's so difficult. He goes rook h8. With what could be more natural than this? To attack the h3 pawn with a check coming in. And Lorenzo now, with just 50 seconds, has to figure out how to win. He goes king d4, attacking the bishop. The bishop drops back. And bishop e1, what a nice move. Taking into control the h4 square. f6, but now this is winning. e6 check. Oh, but he makes a mistake with bishop g3, fe, king e5. That variation, by the way, was beautiful. e6, rook c1 with the idea of bishop b4, mate, and bishop g3. That was winning, but here it's still winning, but it's not totally winning. And he blunders. He should have gone to d4. He goes king f4, giving up the d6 pawn. Hans Niemann is back, king d6. Very excited. Again adjusting himself in the chair. Now that he's not winning, but he saves himself, it seems. Check, king d7. But he goes king c6, king c5. Check. King b6. Actually, king c5, king b6 he goes. h4. Bishop comes back to c8. White is winning now. A beautiful way to win is bishop e5, attacking here. If rook takes e5, you have rook takes c8. He goes bishop c7 check. King b7 and he goes bishop d6. These time pressure moments are always so stressful. You can never play them accurately, especially with so much pressure, tension. But here Lorenzo trying to do that, goes bishop d4, makes a huge error. Rook e4, so that if you take on g7, I go bishop f5, king f5 and rook takes h4. With a rook bishop versus rook, Hans finds it. Lorenzo cannot take here, it would be a draw. He takes the bishop, but this is now a draw. Bishop takes g7, Hans quickly brings his king back. He knows that he can hold this. King e7, yes. He brings the king in, h6, king f7. And bishop to f6, a nice move. King g8 is forced, king g6 played. Hans gives a check, bishop g5. Now only drawing moves are rook g2 and rook g3. He goes rook g1, the farthest away. But this is a dark square. And the problem is now I go f6 and I'm threatening f7 followed by h7. So you need to stop one of these pawns. You go rook f1, but now this move bishop e3 is an absolutely stunning move by Lorenzo. You take away the g1 square, which is why you had to be on g2 or g3 with your rook. h7 check, king h8, f7. You can't take the bishop because of queen, and so Hans has to give a check, and Lorenzo finds bishop g5. Now f8 queen is coming. If you move the rook, bishop f6 check, and Hans resigns. 1-0 up in the match. What a drama that was. And we go to the next game immediately of 15 plus 10. He goes bishop f8 here. Lorenzo only needs a draw here, and Hans needs to win on demand. Position is equal. Can Hans create something here? Can he stay in Goa? Rook d7 played. He goes rook to d1, offering a trade. There are some chances here for white, because black is a bit passive, and there you have Hans bringing in his rook. He's looking good. This is real chances for Hans Niemann. He goes pawn to g4, h5 played. Maybe it's time to bring the king in at some point. King g2, king f3, king e4. He goes rook to c8. And now rook to d8, offering a trade of rooks. No, he takes the pawn. Hans Niemann being a bit greedy there, breaking his structure. And bishop takes c5, rook takes c5 taken. Maybe pawn takes was also possible, but rook takes, rook f8. Lorenzo is like, I don't want to trade rooks. But now Hans is coming into the 7th rank. Yes, rook c7, king h6. Maybe, yeah, this was the only move. What about rook d7? Well, maybe you take twice. He comes in, takes. And now what? Do you want to go rook b8? That's too passive. He takes on h5. And Hans takes on b7. Rook to d8. He's coming back from d4 to b4. b5 played. King to g6. And now rook a7 by Hans. Rook to d5. And rook a5. He comes back and attacks the b6 pawn. Incredible. Rook a6, he defends. Tries to attack again. Defends. It's a draw maybe. No, of course Hans wants to play on. He brings his king up. This is very intense game, because now the b pawn is really dangerous. Black has to create counterplay on the king side. Hans goes king e3. The king has an open path here. King f5. Well, Hans's elimination is at stake here. Everything to play for. King d4. The king is coming in. Will the b5 pawn be able to win the game for Hans. He goes king c5. Rook goes back to b8. And maybe the king and these three pawns can create that much needed counterplay. b6 played. He goes king f3. And now rook a2 protecting the f2 pawn. f5. b6. Oh, it's a race. It's a big race. f4. And now b7 pushes forward. e3. He pushes forward his pawn as well. F takes e3. F takes e3. Taken. And rook a3 pinning the pawn, not letting it advance. Lorenzo needs to find like king coming back, threatening e2. Maybe there's rook a8. Hans goes king c6. Rook a2, he comes back, king f3, rook a3, king f4. And now rook a8. Gains some time on the clock, takes on b7. King takes on b7. And this is a draw. He goes e2, rook e1, rook e8. And now very important to play king g3, because if king f3, there is rook e5. It's a very important move. He finds king g3. Lorenzo Lodici. What a guy. Takes on h3. That final trick by Hans Niemann, he even dodges that. Rook e3 check. King g2. King c6, king f2. And he plays up, king f3 comes in. The king comes back, but just too late. The black king is kind of shouldering the white king. Hans almost had lost on time there. He had 1 second. Check, but that's not enough. The draw is not enough. He needs to win. The g pawn is going. King g3 finds it, and Hans Niemann knows that it's a draw and he has to accept it. Rook a1. Lorenzo Lodici just seconds away from qualifying to the third round, and a draw has been agreed. Lorenzo wins, and look at that celebration there by him. He has just knocked out Hans Niemann from the FIDE World Cup 2020.